Hi, Year 5. Okay, so we're going to move on to chapter 2 from Whale Boy. All the way back along the old town road, Michael's outside smiled at people and greeted them politely. But inside, disappointment and anger swirled like a hurricane, a storm so fierce that he hardly knew what his outside was doing. When he finally noticed where he was, he found he was standing on Cat's Paw Beach, the little strand just out of town, near his grandmother's house. A slap on the shoulder brought his inside and outside properly back together. It was So-So, who had been his father's friend and had taught him about boats and fishing after Samuel's own father, Michael's grandpa, Ivor, had drowned in a storm. "Ah, Michael, my star brother!" So-So exclaimed with a huge beaming smile and another slap on the back that made Michael's teeth rattle. Michael knew So-So must be old, but he was so spry and strong it was hard to think of him that way. It was only So-So's brain that didn't work so well these days. Perhaps never had. Michael's gran said that So-So had been born with a mind that was visiting the cherubs. Once he had had a little house and a boat and fished every day, but somehow he'd lost them both. Then he'd helped in Samuel's boat, and now he lived under a tree on the beach. He wore all sorts of strange things that he found as clothing. Today, a threadbare orange beach towel as a skirt and a long necklace made from the wrinkles from drinks cans. He stood in front of Michael and looked intently into his face. "Your heart is troubled, my brother Star," he said. "I know it." So-So might visit angels and wear trash as jewellery, but Michael's dad had always said that he saw things other people didn't. He rested a big hand on Michael's shoulder. "Be not troubled, my star brother," he said. "You are growing into a strong man, and the sun shall not smite you by day, nor the moon by night, not while So-So is here, your father's friend." There was a sadness in So-So's eyes that made it hard to hold his gaze, but there was a calmness too. Michael felt the hurricane inside die down. He sighed. "Better, better," said So-So, nodding. "You are like your father. One moment sunlight and the next shadow. One moment storm and the next calm. But now you are peaceful, see? We will fish. Pascal says the fish are in the bay." He pointed to the far end of the beach, where a little knot of people had formed around a net, and handed Michael a face mask and snorkel. Michael smiled at his father's old friend, and together they ran down the beach to join the fishing party. Pascal Loubiere had been fishing Cat's Paw Bay for 50 years. He spent his days playing dominoes with his cronies in a hut overlooking the beach so he could watch the water and the sky. He could tell, like no one else, when there were fish to be caught. So when Mr. Loubiere asked for help with his net, you knew it would be worth your while. Michael trod water while Mr. Loubiere, So-So, and 5 other regular helpers waded up to their chests to spread the net in an arc across the cove. It was good to be in the water. Floating here, with the green heights of the island billowing up above the town and the ocean cradling his body, he felt better. Gran would know where to find old Mr. Levi. He would get his down payments back. He would buy another boat somewhere else. Mr. Loubiere waved, and Michael put the mask over his face and dived. Suspended in the water, between the softly gleaming sand and the crinkled brightness of the surface, was a big shoal of ballyhoo, like a woven basket of silver threads, moving this way and that in the water. Michael swam towards them, coaxing them between Mr. Loubiere's helpers and within the line of the net. This wasn't as good as being out at sea in a boat, but it would do for now. As Michael wriggled his damp body back into his clothes, So-So gave him half of his own share of the catch and a plastic bucket to carry the fish in. "Don't want to be like some bong-belly picnic," he said, patting his stomach. "Only need enough to eat and buy some smokes." Michael tried to thank him, but So-So just waved his hands in front of his face and backed away down the beach, laughing. "You are creation stepper, my brother Star," he called out. "You are sun and dark. You walk the world of trouble with no fear." It was the perfect time to be selling fresh fish. People were hurrying home and looking for something for supper. Almost at once, an old green car drew up alongside the pavement where Michael stood with his bucket. A lady in sunglasses smiled out at him. "Michael, how are you?" It was Eugenia's mother. Eugenia was in the back seat with her baby brother, Mostyn. She looked at him disapprovingly. as always. I'm good, thanks, Mrs. Thompson. You want some fish? I do indeed. In fact, you've just saved us from having nothing but rice for supper. I'll take all you have. Fine, I just need to keep some back for my gran. Of course, Mrs. Thompson handed over a $5 bill. You want to take the bucket for the fish, Mrs. Thompson? Michael asked. I've got a little bag for my grans. Oh, that's kind, Michael, she said. I'll get Eugenia to bring it to the Flying Fish tonight. Michael's face showed his astonishment. So I guess you didn't know, Mrs. Thompson laughed and turned round to Eugenia. Tell Michael about your new job, Eugenia. Eugenia was fussing with her baby brother's hair and spoke without looking at him. I'm going to wait tables for Mr. Joseph, she said. She's saving to put herself through college, Mrs. Thompson told him proudly. Eugenia said nothing. She just carried on making sure her brother's perfectly white socks were folded down just the same on each foot. Poor kid, thought Michael. He can't get away from her wanting everything in straight lines. Thanks for the fish, Michael, said her mother. No problem, Mrs. Thompson. Michael smiled his best businessman's smile and waved as the car coughed and grumbled its way into the traffic. Saving for college indeed. Michael punched the fence of the Morning Glory bakery and made its boards ring. Now he would have Eugenia's nagging all evening as well as all day. Still, the thought of Eugenia eating fish that he'd caught was almost enough to put a spring back in his step. I may not amount to much in your eyes, Eugenia Thompson, he said to himself, but your belly would be growling tonight if it weren't for me. Chapter 3. The sun was sinking as Michael ran home, and on the last bend he almost bumped into someone in the fading light. It was Gran, on her way back from her job in the Shiny Row laundry in town. Even though she was older than the hills, she kept on working. Nobody's going to look out for you and me, my boy, she always said, so we got to do it for our own selves. Gran had been looking out for Michael for most of his life, since his mum had gone back to England when he was a tiny baby. His mum came from an old Liberty family. Back in the whaling days they had been harpooners, but had moved to London when she was very small. She had met Michael's father when she'd returned to Liberty for a visit one year at carnival time. Samuel thought they'd always lived together on the island. She just wasn't mother material, was all Gran could ever be persuaded to say about her. Michael didn't even know what his mother looked like. There wasn't a single photograph of her anywhere. But she must have been pretty, because in the end Dad had decided to leave Liberty and join his older brother Davis in England so he could look for his wife. He'd sold his fishing boat to pay for the ticket. That was 6 years ago now, almost 7, and they hadn't heard a word from him since. At first, Gran had written a few letters to an address in London, but Samuel had never written back. Michael remembered their last day together, fishing far from shore, making plans to buy a bigger boat, maybe take tourists out on trips. Who knows, Michael, his father had said. Maybe we could find some of the old whales to show him, eh? After he left, Michael had wondered about the whales and what Samuel had told him. Do you remember the whales around the island? He'd asked Gran. Oh, my goodness, yes, she'd said, her eyes wide. When I was little, a few ships still came into harbour with the barrels of whale oil on their decks. Your great-grandfather, Grandpa's daddy, he worked on a whaleboat when he was a boy, up in the crow's nest, watching for spouts. He was a champion whale finder, Ivor always used to say. Gran had never seen a live whale, but she'd seen their bones. Big as rocks they were, stuck in the bottom of the harbour. All rotted away now, though, I expect. The only bones left are in that hotel where the rich people stay. She shook her head sadly. It's a shame and disgrace that we killed those great creatures. That's my opinion. Gran had been right about the bones. Michael's school teacher took the class to see the sperm whale skeleton in the foyer of the Rathbourne Hotel in town. It was painted white and bigger than the inside of Gran's house. So big, it was impossible to imagine it had been inside a living body, a body that swam and floated in the sea. Even Eugenia, who never cared about anything but books and learning, was impressed. I wish there were still whales, she'd sighed, and was quiet for a whole 15 minutes. So at least Samuel hadn't been making it all up. But nobody had seen a whale spout anywhere near the island in half a century. They were just a story now, something not quite real anymore. like Michael's father. Even though the Wales and his father had gone, Michael decided that he could still make real plans. He would work hard and get a boat of his own and go back out onto the sea. Gran didn't like boats and she didn't want him to go out on the sea. After her husband drowned, his boat had disappeared in a hurricane when Samuel was tiny. The sea had always scared her. She'd never liked Samuel and Michael going out fishing. So because Michael loved his Gran and didn't want her to worry, he didn't tell her about his plans or why he worked so hard and saved his money so carefully. Life had been very tough for Gran. She was the only person in Michael's whole family who hadn't been busy leaving the country or dying. "I'm durable," she used to tell him when he was small. "That means I'll last for a long, long time, so I can always take care of you." But she'd begun to look far from durable. Coming across her in the dusk, Michael noticed once again how small she was. He had been taller than her for more than a year. She was tiny and fragile. Now she needed his protection. "Goodness me," Gran exclaimed. "You gave me a fright there, Ivor." Lately, she had started calling him by the wrong name. At first he'd complained to her, but she got so upset that he began to ignore it so as not to hurt her feelings. After all, the names weren't any old wrong names, but names of other people in his family. Usually it was Ivor. Sometimes it was Davis, the name of her elder son. He was wild, that boy, Gran would say, shaking her head. He'd gone to London to drive a taxi, while his younger brother Samuel was still in school, long before Michael was born. He didn't write or visit either, but Gran always got a card from him at Christmas. And sometimes Gran would call Michael by his father's name. It hurt every time she did it, because it was the only time they mentioned Samuel these days. Somehow they'd both stopped talking about him. "Oh," Gran put down her bags. Michael couldn't help noticing how big they looked compared to her. She clapped a hand to her mouth. "Did I just call you Ivor? I must be losing my mind." "No, Gran," Michael reassured her. "You didn't. You're as sharp as a tack. Hey, give me those bags." "I can carry my own bags," she said. Gran never liked to rely on anyone. "Don't rely on another soul, then you don't owe nobody a thing," was one of her many favourite sayings. But Michael picked up her bags anyway, and she didn't argue. They walked on in silence while the sun finished sinking. The velvet soft dark crept out from under the trees by the side of the road as they reached the rickety little gate into their front garden. It creaked and grumbled open, and Gran began to climb the steep, narrow path under the grapefruit trees. "So, why were you running so hard, Michael?" Gran wheezed as she plonked herself down on the bench on the veranda. "You near run me down. Something the matter, eh?" In some ways, Michael thought, Gran really was still as sharp as a tack. She could tell when something was wrong, even if he tried not to show it. "I'm fine," he lied, "and I have fish for your supper." Michael took the bags inside and lit the tilly lamp. He put the fish on a plate under a fly screen and went back out to sit beside her. Gran knew all the old people in Rosetown. She would know where to find old Mr. Levi and get his down payment money back. But he had to be careful, or she would wonder why he was asking about him. Now wasn't the right time to reveal his boat plans, so he did his best to sound as casual as possible when he asked, "You see that big fence they put up next to the fish market?" Gran's eyes grew wide. "I have," she said. "I have indeed. And you know old Edison Levi had a little business next to the market. You maybe didn't know him, but I was at school with that boy's sister, Marietta. The new Marine Enterprises people, they took his shack and his boats, just took 'em, like that." She snapped her fingers. "And he dropped dead on the spot. Dead! That business was all he had. No wife, no children, just that. It's a scandal." Michael was glad he was sitting down. "You sure you're fine, Michael?" Gran asked. He managed to nod, to say that he had to get to work. He even made a joke about saving to take her on a cruise ship, which made her laugh. "Wouldn't catch me on one of them floating skyscrapers," she said. Then he changed out of his school uniform and walked back into town with his heart heavy as a rock in his chest. Okay, we'll carry on with chapter 4 tomorrow. Bye.